Fellow Sazaiters, a few weeks ago, General Constantino Chiwenga did the unthinkable. He walked straight up to President Mnangagwa and handed him a document now famously referred to as the Chiwenga dossier. Now, in that dossier, General Chiwenga issued a stark warning. He said, Zimbabwe is sliding back into the very conditions that triggered the 2017 coup. Now, in plain language, he was pretty much telling the president that you are becoming the Robert Mugabe that we removed in 2017. Now, that moment should have been a turning point. We should have witnessed the so-called Chiwenga disappearing forever. Instead, the complete opposite happened. All the people targeted by Chiwenga in his dossier now appear stronger than ever. And Chiwenga himself, on the other hand, appears weaker by the day. In fact, Tagwire now moves around in unmarked vehicles. And the general has noticeably toned down on his once fiery anti-corruption rhetoric. So what happened? Or rather, what is happening? Ladies and gentlemen, in this episode, I'm going to show you clearly how power operates in Zimbabwe. We are going to dive deep into the Chiwenga dossier and how Justice Minister Ziambi responded to it. This should give us clarity on where we stand politically. Fellow Sazaiters, slay queens and bingers, socialites, papalites, wasinamalites, varikudyarais, never cinema rights. Welcome to the special report. Now, for the benefit of those who might not know, a few weeks ago, like I said in my intro, VP Chiwenga did what Blessed Geza had been calling for months. He confronted ED with a damning report that is now being referred to as the Chiwenga dossier. This dossier is action-packed like Movado's song. It paints a picture of a ruling party that is being distorted and captured by powerful businessmen surrounding the president. And Chiwenga calls these businessmen criminals who are influencing decisions, pumping money into internal politics, and creating what he calls a parallel power structure inside ZANU-PF. He warns that this environment, the combination of money, influence, and informal power, is taking Zimbabwe back to the same conditions that led to the 2017 coup. And just like in 2017 with SB Moyo's speech, Chiwenga's document doesn't actually attack ED directly. It doesn't accuse him personally. Instead, it places the blame on the people around ED. But the implication is heavy. If these businessmen are shaping the party and the state, then leadership is either unaware, compromised, failing to act, or Chiwenga operating with the full blessing and instruction of the president himself. This was a bomb, a ballistic missile unleashed by the general, political style, or should I say Gangnam style, because he was trying to numb the gang of Chiwenga. But if the Chiwenga dossier was a ballistic missile, then Mnangagwa had a perfect anti-ballistic shield, because what followed was a response that shook Chiwenga's faction in more ways than one. Mnangagwa didn't just defend himself. He counterattacked. He responded to the Chiwenga dossier through the Minister of Justice, Ziambi. I call him Z squared. Remember, this guy also leads the ZANU-PF legal department. So in his response to the dossier on behalf of the president, Zyambi dismissed the dossier as reckless, malicious, and effectively treasonous. He also warned that anyone who tries to destabilize government on the basis of claims made by this dossier would be committing treason. Actually, when you read Zyambi's response closely in its entirety, you immediately realize that this response was doing something much broader. It was more than just a simple response to Chiwenga. It was more like a state of the power address, one that elevated Tagwirei and relegated Chiwenga. But don't get it twisted. Tagwirei's power is not independent. Actually, to understand Tagwirei's rise, we must start with a simple truth that Tagwirei's money is powerful, but it is nothing without the gun. The gun ultimately controls everything. Yet, Zyambi's response to the Chiwenga dossier revealed a crucial detail from 2017. That Tagwirei bankrolled the 2017 coup. Now that single admission tells us everything. Back then, the gun alone wasn't enough to execute Operation Restore Legacy, because at the time, the G40 still controlled the treasury and state funds. So the military side desperately needed private money, and Tagwirei provided it. The bottom line is, in 2017, the gun needed Tagwirei's money just as badly as Tagwirei's money now needs the gun. But there is one very important dynamic that I want to emphasize. You see, for the first time in many years, Zimbabwe now has a president who fully commands the military's top leadership. This is something that Robert Mugabe lost in his latter years, and something that ED himself didn't fully possess in the early years of his presidency. Consider the following. Under Robert Mugabe, in 37 years, the ZNA had 4 commanders. These are Mujuru, Chiwenga, Zinavashe, and Sibanda. Of course, there is also Sandy McLean, but McLean was commander during the integration process when the army was still being set up. So I'm actually counting from 1981 when Mujuru took over as commander. So let's make it 36 years under Mugabe. Only 4 ZNA commanders. But under Mnangagwa, in about 8 years, give or take, the ZNA has had 5 different commanders. ED is constantly reshuffling his army. It's not a mistake. It's deliberate. It is a strategy. Mnangagwa understood the lesson of 2017. If you leave army generals in one position for too long, they build influence, and they may eventually become political players. That is how the 2017 coup became possible. Remember, by 2017, General Sibanda had been in charge of the ZNA for about 13 years. And General Chiwenga had been in charge of the ZDF also for about 13 years. Moreover, before Chiwenga took over at the ZDF, it was Vitalis Zinavashe in charge for almost 10 years. In fact, according to the former CIO, Deputy Director General, Lavmo Mukandi, Zinavashe used to go to ED Mnangagwa's house and brief him on state security issues even long after Mnangagwa had left the Ministry of State Security. Mukandi revealed this information in his autobiography. If this revelation is true, then it is very telling. It shows us how ED slowly but surely consolidated power. he had no business getting briefed by the ZDF commander, because at the time, he was the Minister of Justice. He was no longer Minister of State Security. But even if Mnangagwa had still been Minister of State Security, that ministry has no oversight over the ZDF. Only the Minister of Defense has that authority. Now, I said all this history to make you understand how ED quietly consolidated power and became more powerful than Robert Mugabe realized. All this became possible mainly because Mugabe did not micromanage his military, and that allowed his generals to build so much influence over time. In contrast, when ED took over, he slowly but surely started reshuffling, redeploying, retiring, and replacing commanders before any of them accumulated deep political networks. And today, every top military officer serves entirely at Mnangagwa's pleasure, at Mnangagwa's benevolence. Mnangagwa is now fully in charge of the military, at least at command level. And when you understand this, Taguire's rise immediately starts making sense. He is not rising as a separate political empire. No. He is rising as ED's trusted ally. Now let's briefly dive into Ziambi's response into the Chiwenga dossier. There are a few issues that I want to highlight. Remember, Ziambi is the Minister of Justice and the Secretary for Legal Affairs in ZANU-PF, meaning the leader of the legal department of ZANU-PF. He is responding on behalf of President Mnangagwa to a document Chiwenga handed over to ED a few weeks ago. A document we have come to know as the Chiwenga dossier. But before we get there, let's first read paragraph 2 from that dossier. I want to show you something. It goes, Comrade President, in November 2017, we took a bold and necessary step to remove former President Robert Mugabe from power because he sought to manipulate our constitution for personal gain, and he allowed certain individuals and family members to seize his executive authority and abuse it. Those are the words of General Chiwenga in his dossier. Now, with these words, the general has for the first time openly admitted to staging a coup in 2017. Remember, officially and legally, there was no coup in Zimbabwe in 2017. The courts ruled that the activities of the army in November 2017 did not amount to a coup. Furthermore, officially speaking, the government still refers to that coup as a military-assisted transition, codenamed Operation Restore Legacy. That is why, when Ziambi responds to this paragraph, he says, Operation Restore Legacy was not about removing Mugabe. He says it was about dealing with criminals that were surrounding the president. Of course, Ziambi is being diplomatic. That coup was primarily about removing Mugabe from power. That's the reason why, after neutralizing the G40, they still pressured Mugabe to step down. And when he initially refused, they initiated an impeachment process. Of course, he eventually stepped down. He resigned. So the general is correct. The coup was about removing Mugabe. The only problem is, he has become the first person in the system to become associated with an admission that there was a coup in November 2017. Now let's go to paragraph 3 of the Chiwenga dossier. Remember, this is General Chiwenga speaking. He writes, during November 2017, we risked everything, our lives, our freedom, our futures, to restore and defend our legacy the party, and the constitution. Now, here the general is talking about what he and his fellow generals risked in staging that coup that removed Mugabe from power. Take a look at how Ziambi responds to this. He goes, "It is denied that any few individuals, particularly the writers of this document, sacrificed their lives for the attainment of Operation Restore Legacy. Zimbabweans from all walks of life rose and participated and supported Operation Restore Legacy." Those are the words of Justice Minister Ziambi. Now, what he did here in his response was very brilliant in its subtlety, if not mischievousness. You see, he not only demystified Chiwenga's role in 2017, he also downplayed the military's role as a whole. He is effectively saying the army couldn't have pulled it off without other factors at play. So, which factors are those, Taffy? Well, thankfully, Ziambi answers that himself. Let's read on. He goes, "There is no denying that Operation Restore Legacy had significant backing. A considerable amount of resources was invested to guarantee its success. It is unlikely that an operation of this scale could have achieved its goals without substantial financial support." Bingo. Ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you that Ziambi raised all this to drive home one very important topic: money. Yes, he does say that Zimbabweans from all walks of life contributed in 2017, but then he proceeds to detail one key contribution that ultimately made the 2017 coup a success: big money. But where did that money come from? Ziambi spells it out. He goes, "For the record, Mr. Kudakwashi Tagwirei put in a total of 5 million liters of fuel, food, and other provisions for soldiers, as requested by the then CDF General Chiwenga." Do you realize what Ziambi just did here? Ziambi just told you that your general is a hypocrite for criticizing Tagwirei, because during the 2017 coup, he requested for millions of dollars from a man he now calls a Chigananda. So Ziambi is not only saying the military got financial assistance from Tagwirei during the 2017 coup, he's also saying that financial assistance was especially requested for by Chiwenga himself. Now let's move to paragraph 5 of the Chiwenga dossier. It goes, "Comrade President, on several occasions, and even abroad, you have informed the nation that you are a constitutionalist. And yet, it is now clear for anyone to see that the so-called 2030 agenda to extend your term of office is real and alive. And this has now taken us back to the ills that led us to November 2017. Now, Ziambi's reply to this is pure gold. He goes, "Indeed, the president is a constitutionalist who has not deviated from the constitution at any time. However, if the people have spoken, should the president disregard the will of the people?" Now, let me translate what Ziambi is saying here. Remember, Ziambi is speaking on behalf of ED. In other words, he is speaking Mnangagwa's mind. Anyway, let me translate. Ziambi is saying, ED is a humble servant. The people want 2030, so who is he to say no? Vox populi, vox Dei. That's Latin for the voice of the people is the voice of God. So, by staying in office until 2030, ED is listening to the voice of the people. And by listening to the voice of the people, he is actually listening to the voice of God himself. Of course, the voice of the people is not the voice of God. It has never been the voice of God, but I'm just trying to show you the reasoning behind the statement. Anyway, Ziambi goes on to drop a bombshell. And no, I'm not talking about Geza. I'm talking about this. He goes, any attempt to destabilize the government on the basis of such falsehoods is tantamount to treason. The message to Chiwenga is very clear. Try anything funny and the treason charge is already typed. I told you, this was more than just a response. It was a state of the power address. Now, paragraph 11 of the dossier attacks the criminals who have turned the president's private office into a parallel government. Ziambi then fires back. He goes, this is a direct and personal attack on the person of the president. Undermining the office and authority of the president is a criminal offense. To question what happens in the president's private space is not only immature, but also meddling and intrusive. This is a clear demonstration of serious disrespect for the president. A good leader is a good follower. The author has shown that he is not a good follower and therefore cannot be a leader. Ladies and gentlemen, in simple English, Ziambi is simply saying General Chiwenga is disqualified from succeeding ED. A full stop. Now, this doesn't mean this is what will happen eventually. It simply means that is what Ziambi is saying. The general is disqualified on account of his opposition to the 2030 project and, of course, attacking Chiwenga. And one of the so-called Chiwengas has been rising steadily. In fact, nowadays, his rise is actually not steady. It's a speedy. Yet, if he's not careful, he could fall faster than Didi. Yes, Tagwire is influential, but he's not supreme. He is protected, but he is not untouchable. He is visible, but not independent. He is powerful, but within Mnangagwa's boundaries. He stands on a double-edged sword. One side elevates him, and the other can end him if he steps outside the lane. Mnangagwa has already warned Tagwire to stop making policy announcements at political rallies. He again suggested that Tagwire should attend the Herbert Chitepo School of Ideology to get proper training on how the party functions. Well, of course, Mnangagwa is a loose cannon, but his words represent a true feeling of the party's old guard who don't necessarily like the direction in which the party is headed. I mean, you would be a fool to think that everyone who is chanting the 2030 slogan is actually truly and wholeheartedly behind ED. However, ED has 3 advantages at the moment. He has taken full charge of the military, at least at command level, and he also has the money, both from treasury and also from the so-called Chiwenga, who will do almost anything financially to appease him. That leaves ED in a very powerful position indeed, well placed to unleash his 2030 plan, with Tagwire right at the center of it. Have you seen how hard he's been working to reclaim Harare for ZANU-PF, or should I say, for ED? After all, nowadays, everything is for ED, isn't it? And yet, the real question remains, how many of these people are genuinely and wholeheartedly behind ED? And if ED truly has firm control at the top command level of the military, What are the chances of mid to lower ranking military officers attempting a coup? Similar to what we've seen repeatedly in West Africa, where captains and colonels have become notorious for seizing power. Well, that sounds like a topic for another special report, where I'll marinate you with all the details without fear or favor, because on this platform, we say it as it is. And as always, thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoy the content, please like and share.